Have you ever played Gretel and Hansel? Of the many Flash games that roamed the internet, few possess the darkness of this one. Given the era they originated in and the lack of censorship back then, it wasn't unusual to stumble upon brutal games and series with explicit content, visceral scenes that surely traumatize more than a few people. This isn't surprising, considering that sites like Friv or Newgrounds were mostly visited by children. One such case is Gretel and Hansel, a Flash game based on the classic children's fairy tale that, despite its innocent aesthetic, contained very graphic and uncomfortable content for those who played it. And while it was nearly lost for about 15 years, it was recently revealed that it might be close to making a comeback. A dreamlike nightmare. Gretel and Hansel is a truly peculiar game. It was a Flash title released in mid-2009, primarily on sites that used Adobe Flash Player like Newgrounds. The project was created by an animator known on the site as Mako Pudding. There isn't much info on them, but they were the one who designed the original version of the game. And sorry if there's a lack of data in this video. For some reason, it's really hard to find concise information about this game. Honestly, if it weren't for the YouTube gameplays, its presence on Newgrounds, and the recently announced remake, which we'll talk about later, this game would feel like one of those creepy things you remember playing as a kid, knowing you probably shouldn't have. Years later, you remember it, and it feels like a fever dream. But no, it's real. Very real. Back to the Grimm origins. As you can tell by the title, which flips the traditional order of the names, the game is based on the story of Hansel and Gretel. You've probably heard the story somewhere, or maybe in some weird analog horror series if you're younger, about two children abandoned in the woods who eat a gingerbread house and then burn the old woman living inside. Happy ending, right? While it's mostly known as a story for children, it's strange to realize that the original version by the Brothers Grimm was horribly disturbing, even for its time. Despite being a fairy tale, the original story treated Hansel and Gretel much more crudely. First off, they didn't just get lost, their parents literally abandoned them to die. The atmosphere was darker, the portrayal of the forest's dangers was grimmer, and the whole tale was quite raw. This was common back then, as children's stories were often used to scare kids into behaving, basically telling them that if they wandered off, a boogeyman would get them. The important thing here is that Gretel and Hansel is based primarily on that original version of the tale, just slightly exaggerated. The story begins at their house where, just like the original, the parents plot to leave their children in the woods so they can keep all the food for themselves. The game itself is a point-and-click adventure. We primarily control Gretel, clicking on objects to interact and guide Hansel. What really stands out is the art style. The entire game uses a watercolor aesthetic that looks like it was pulled straight from an antique storybook. But without a doubt, the most striking feature is the graphic nature of the game overs. Gretel can interact with many things, and many of these lead to one of the two children meeting a terrible end, often depicted in a crude and disturbing way. Describing them all would take too long, but let's just say they involve Hansel turning on his sister, the mother being responsible, or some environmental hazard leading to Gretel's demise. Each game over is unsettling because the childlike art style makes the gore feel wrong, to say the least. In fact, on Steam, almost all of the achievements consist of finding every possible way to die. The main goal is to flee from the mother who is out to get them, while surviving the forest and collecting certain bags. From what I understand, these bags contain substances I probably shouldn't mention. I think you know the kind of substances I'm talking about. The sequel and the future. Even though Gretel tries to negotiate with her mother using these substances, it doesn't work. The mother chases them down using her husband as a literal horse. That was the original game, but years later it received a sequel, Gretel and Hansel 2. This sequel followed the siblings after being abandoned in the woods. A notable detail is that the game features cameos from other Grimm brothers stories, also in their much more disturbing original versions. For example, Gretel ends up in a hollow log house where she's forced to eat a human arm in order to avoid being turned into a log herself. I'd say the game overs here are even more brutal than in the first game. Gretel can meet her end by being disintegrated, sliced, shot, or falling victim to hallucinogenic mushrooms. Gretel herself isn't exactly innocent either. She has no qualms about finishing off other fairy tale creatures in brutal ways. The game even has hidden, darker subplots, like a ghost woman who was a victim of her own husband. The game feels so strange because the art style makes you feel like you are inside the original Grimm tale. At one point, you even control Hansel after Gretel loses her face. Since he's a bit dim-witted, he has to be guided by fairies. The remake and beyond. The game doesn't have a massive amount of plot outside of solving puzzles to progress and using a mirror to return faces to certain ghosts. The most significant part is the ending. The siblings reach a massive, dilapidated house in the woods, most likely the witch's house. It was a much grimmer portrayal that we were likely meant to see in Gretel and Hansel 3. Unfortunately, that third part never arrived. For the last 15 years, there was absolutely no new content, at most a re-release on Steam. That is, until a few months ago. A full remake of the first game was recently announced and officially released. It improves many things. The art style was revamped while keeping its essence, now looking even more like a storybook. The environments are 3D, and they added collectibles, puzzles, and new secrets. Of course, these improvements were also applied to those brutal game overs, which now look even more disturbing than before. It was a brilliant way for the creators to bring back this Newgrounds classic. While there's no official confirmation for a remake of the second game, it's very likely. Perhaps with this momentum, they will finally decide to make Gretel and Hansel 3 and continue the story of the siblings entering the witch's house, likely burning her alive in an oven before witnessing many more brutal death scenes. It's fascinating how games like this, born in the deepest corners of the internet through Flash technology, can find new life. With the support the remake is getting, we might be finally close to seeing the conclusion of this lost Flash game and its disturbing secrets.